So sure, the rent is too damn high. But are we currently in a housing crisis? Or is the housing market working exactly as it was intended to work?
And is tenant organizing the solution? Like, should I be trying to unionize my building? Welcome to Pullback, where we explore big new ideas and ask, is this a real solution or a distraction? Pullback is a proud member of the Harbinger Media Network of progressive Canadian podcasts. I'm Kyla Hewson, and I'm here with my co-host, Kristen Pugh.
On our very first episode of our brand new season, we were joined by Ricardo Tranjan of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives to talk everything housing. Ricardo just wrote a fantastic new book called The Tenant Class, which makes the argument that tenants are an exploited class and calls for more tenant organizing as a solution.
I loved this book. I loved the way he talked about how the market is working exactly as it's intended to. I loved the way he talked about how supply isn't the problem, even though that's where all of our policy seems to be going. And that instead of building more housing, what we actually need is like more regulation for the economically exploited tenant class in our world where landlord profits are skyrocketing. And I absolutely loved it, and I'm really excited for everyone to have a listen.
Definitely. Yeah, I think Ricardo did such a good job in this book and in our conversation of sort of taking that it's all about the supply argument to task. And I mean, making the case that really more market housing anyway isn't going to solve the problem. What we need is social housing in addition to the regulations you talked about. So I thought it was a really fantastic conversation. I learned a lot. And also Ricardo's just so charismatic and fun.
And before we get started, we actually have a very exciting announcement. This is season 2 of our revamped sort of podcast style. And our first season was a huge success. And hello to all of our new listeners. And, hello to all of our long-term listeners who've been with us for, a couple of years. Happy 4th anniversary, Kristen. It's our 4-year anniversary. We started in 2019. A lot of stuff has happened.
Yes, indeed.
And to celebrate our 4th year, I've finally decided to open up a Patreon account for us so that our supporters can shoot us a couple of bucks a month and we can pay. Like, this costs money to do, and it's a hobby and we love doing it. And it's something that, because it's an educational project and Kristen is a genius, we want to share her knowledge. Don't shake your head at me. And to get us started, we're actually going to run a little contest when we get to, I think I'm going to do 10 subscribers. When we get to 10 Patreon subscribers, I will do a draw and send one of our graffitied books that we've done on the podcast to somebody. So if you sign up for Patreon, shoot us a message at pullbackpod@gmail.com. And I'll do a little draw once we get to just 10. It's easy. 10. It's like a 1 in 10 chance of getting a free book. That is, and I won't send Waste Free World, even though that one has the most notes in it, unless you really want it.
It's a good thing we haven't done the Bill Gates book yet.
Maybe that's the one I'll send out to people just as a little treat. Let's get started.
Ricardo, thank you so much for talking to us today about your fantastic book, The Tenant Class. We both loved it. First question for you, is Canada in a housing crisis right now?
There's a lot of people in Canada right now experiencing hardship of the worst kind. A lot of people who do not have a place to go to. In the end of the day, people struggling to pay rent and worry that if they pay rent, there's not going to be money enough for anything else. And they will have to cut short on food and not buy the jacket that the kid needs to go to school and be warm all winter. And those are real experiences. And those are it's real hardship. And I don't mean to belittle it. But I don't think it's useful to categorize it as a crisis, because when we call it a crisis, we have this impression that it's something new and it's something unexpected, whereas the housing market has been structured in the same way for many, many decades, and the things getting worse slowly. We're watching governments are choosing not to intervene. Also, when we talk about a crisis, we have the sense that everyone's impacted, or that most people are impacted, right? Like we think about COVID right now. COVID, everyone was impacted one way or another. And also with the housing market right now, it's not everyone that is negatively impacted. Some people are making a lot of money out of this. A lot of people don't want anything else, things to change. Many people are safely housed, securely housed in homes whose values are appreciating tremendously, which will make them very comfortable in their retirement. And there's only one group that is mostly negatively impacted, and it's the group of people who rent or people who are unhoused. And then finally, I think it's not useful to call it a crisis, because a crisis, we kind of tend to think about something that everyone wants to solve, something that everyone kind of wants it to go away because it's a crisis, and we kind of want to be done with it as soon as possible. And again, that couldn't be farthest from the truth. There's people right now in certain industries who are actively lobbying for things to remain the same. They're benefiting tremendously. And just last week, I was reading an investor company talking about, like a real estate investment company. It was their report back to their investors. And they were openly saying like, oh, this crisis is not going away anytime soon. There's a lot of money to be made. So keep investing, keep giving us your money. So they're actively involved in preserving things the way they are, or making them worse if that will increase their margins of return. So I don't think calling it a crisis, it's useful.
And I want to get into the argument in the book is that it's more impactful to talk about it as like a market that's working and to talk about it in the lens of class struggle. But just before we get into that broader theme, you also talk about the problem with talking about the housing crisis, if you want to use that term, as a problem of supply. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about why that is a problem.
That's the dominant narrative right now in Canada. Just yesterday, I was watching the Prime Minister make some announcements related to a housing program and clearly state to folks and say, we haven't built enough housing and that's why they're expensive. And unfortunately, that is a really disingenuous statement. I'm sure that someone with his knowledge and his access to expertise knows that there's many other factors that have contributed to making housing so expensive, that has contributed to making rents so expensive. The problem with that argument, the supply and demand argument, is that it's very, very intuitive. Right? It sounds like, the notion of supply and demand, everyone has come across somehow and they relate to and say, yeah, if there's not enough things, the prices go up. And if there's too many people wanting something, the prices go up. But if a lot of it, the prices go down. And the problem with that is twofold. First, it's not true. It's way more complicated than that, right? So the Prime Minister coming in saying, cities are getting on the way of building more housing, and that's why we're not building as much housing, and now it's too expensive. It's incredibly disingenuous. There's a lot of policies related to the securitization of mortgages, meaning how mortgages are insured and who is allowed to insure, to provide mortgages and so on and so forth. That has changed since the 1980s, and that has made mortgages a lot more accessible. And mortgages being a lot more accessible, interest rates being really low, mortgages being insured by third-party government agencies like the CMHC, it just makes mortgages very easily available, credit very attainable, to the point that when you go buy a house and you say, it's 200,000, and then they ask like, no, could you pay 230 instead? Your bank's gonna give you that additional 30,000. You're gonna finance it over 30 years. It's not gonna make a difference. So you're willing to do that. And if you're willing to do that, so the next time someone's gonna ask 240 and 250. So there's a lot there that explains the kind of a little bit the rise in prices, for example. And with rents is the same thing. There's a lot more to than just supply and demand. In the world of like financialized capitalism, a lot of the small condo apartments in Toronto and Vancouver, those little condos, they're literally safety boxes. They're a place to park money. No one ever needs to live there, Just think about folks that have too much money and they have investment portfolios that must be diversified. They invest in all sorts of things, and now they have still like sitting on money, and they're like, oh, we need to do something with it. And then like, oh, buy that condo and that condo and that condo. Get me 10 of those because I need to park money somewhere. And whether you people in it or not, doesn't matter. Like they're literally safety boxes, right? So there's a lot more to the supply and demand argument. But in the end, it's a self-serving argument because you have to kind of follow the argument, right? The problem is supply. Okay, so let's build more housing. And how is that we're going to build more housing? That's how is that we're going to build a lot more housing and fast? We're going to give more incentives, more subsidies, more tax breaks, more public land to developers and to landlords. And they will build us out of this crisis, right? So all of a sudden, you have managed to make the real estate investors, the private sector that has put so many people at this very insecure financial position by hiking up prices, by increasing profit margins, by demanding too much return on investment and too fast. Now you're portraying them as our saviors, as the people who are going to get out of this crisis. Today, the federal government announced a GST rebate on purpose-built rent. Initially, it sounds like a reasonable policy. If you're going to build purpose rent apartment buildings and you're getting a financial incentive from the federal government, it sounds like a good thing. But now in the next days, we have to follow up and see whether there's going to be anything required of them. If there's going to be rent controls in any of those units, if there's anything whatsoever that is going to ensure that that incentive on the cost side actually going to become a direct lowering of the cost. And it might not. It might turn out just to increase the profit margins, right? So it's a self-serving argument, the supply and demand one, and that's why it's not going to go away. It doesn't matter. Like we can, I don't mean to be pessimist, but we can mount a lot of evidence. We can mount a lot of arguments, but it's such a sweet argument, and it's so directly self-serving that we're likely going to hear it for a long time.
Yeah, one thing that I found really, that really convinced me in your book when you were talking about this point was you were sort of saying, okay, if supply and demand was really the thing, then we should see rents go down when the vacancy rate goes up. And in fact, there doesn't seem to be a relationship at all. Rents are just always going up, even when vacancy rates are up. I guess that part of the argument, you say, let's then turn the focus onto landlord profits. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that.
I love to talk a lot more about this, but guess what? We have very little data on it. That's where this becomes a PR almost war, right? A public relations and communications war, because for most part, landlords just cry poor and expect us to take their word for it. There's very little data on the margins of profit of landlords, and so when they come and say, we have to raise rents, otherwise we can't get by, we won't make it. And it's like, show your books, let me see your numbers, and we don't have the data. We're supposed to take the word for it. There are very large share of the rental market stock, especially the purpose-built apartment buildings, that has already been paid off because those are older buildings, and unfortunately we stopped building them. And yet, when interest rates go up, everyone is up in arms and say, but my mortgage. And it's like, do you really have a mortgage? and sometimes they're loans because they refinance for construction and renovations and so on. But like, there's so many times that you hear just the crying poor and you don't have the data. The real estate investment trusts, those are like, there are a bunch of rules around them. And one of them is that they have to make their finances public. And they also make their finances public because that's a way of attracting more investors.
Can you just, before you go into that, can you just explain how those work?
Real estate investment trusts, which we often call REITs, are a relatively new type of landlord. Instead of being a simple firm that owns and manages real estate and rental units and tries to kind of just maintain those units and whose sole source of revenue is the rental income. These are investors who come in, buy lots of buildings, and then they sell shares to investors. It can be pretty much anyone. Anyone can go online and through their financial institution buy some shares of REITs. It can also sometimes be large investors, and we have a lot of our pension funds kind of playing that game. But anyways, they sell these shares and then they manage this asset, as they call it. And this asset is supposed to generate two things. It's supposed to generate regular revenue, which they will give back to net revenue, which they will pay back to their investors. It's called distribution. And they're also going to generate long-term capital gains, because when you sell your shares, you're probably going to sell for a price higher than you bought it. So you kind of also make money there. The financial investor in many ways doesn't function as a common corporations, among other things. And most importantly, it doesn't need to pay business taxes, right? It's only the individual investors who have all of these little shares, or sometimes a big pile of them, that pay taxes. Most of the taxes you pay as in-person income taxes, and only a piece of it you pay as capital gains. So it is a much more aggressive type of landlord usually, and there's some research coming out that's corroborating that point, and research especially from Martin August at University of Waterloo, also Nimoy Lewis at the Metropolitan University, Julie Ma at University of Toronto, who beginning to be able to show that these landlords are much more aggressive in their day-to-day practice, because they have this pressure of generating quick returns and high margins of return. And often how they're going to do this is to what they call reposition their units. Reposition the units is essentially finding a way to get the current tenants out, give the place a facelift, and then rent to other tenants who are willing to pay a lot more. And then in that flip, they make money. They manage to increase their distribution to their investors, who are going to appreciate the higher return, sometimes knowing that that's the result of evictions of families. Most time, they're actually not aware that that's what's happening.
That's horrific and sounds like it should be illegal. What would happen if this is not related to housing, but what would happen if we just shut the stock market down? Like the whole thing is just like, it's evil all the way down. I can't.
There is a proposal, and it's the Canadian Center for Policy Alternative, and our housing proposals and many others have called for the end of the special tax treatment of REITs. There's actually one MP Michael Morris from the Green Party I think it's Kitchener. Mike Morris is doing some good work there, and then he's also trying to push for the end of the special treatment to REITs. In practice, what they're likely to happen is that they will become large corporate landlords. And so that is the question, is that any better? I think overall it's better, because I do not like the idea of so many individuals and families and hardworking folks who are just contributing to their pensions and kind of assuming or expecting or hoping that their pensions are doing some are not in the business of evicting other people. I like them not to be involuntarily or indirectly engaged in the landlord business. The thing with REITs is that I would give it to them, they're way more transparent than corporate landlords. Not that they give a damn about what we say about their figures. They're proud of it, but at least provides us some insight into what I believe are not unique margins of profit or unique practices. I think it's not unique to this particular model. I think it's just an insight into what that world is. Again, I think they have the resources and the capacity to be more deliberate and more aggressive than kind of smaller landlords. So yeah, overall, I think it would be better to get rid of them. But then actually, here's a funny story. The CEO of one of the largest REITs in the country called me once, and it was going to be a 10-minute conversation. It ended up being an hour conversation. And it was actually very interesting. We were very frank with each other. Let's just put it that way. But we kind of got into each other's head a little bit, understanding, how each other thinks. And at the end of it, he asked me, he's like, so Ricardo, why do you and Martin August and your colleagues come after us? We're such a small share of the market overall, right? Shouldn't you be going after others? And I had to be honest with the guy, and I was like, you make it easy for us because there's all your data out there, and I know your books are open, whereas everyone else in this industry is so shady about. And they're like, yeah, corporate landlords, the larger ones that we're competing with, they should also have to show their books. I was like, there you go. We can say we agreed on one thing today. And then we just ended the call there just to finish on a good, on a good note.
It's just so interesting to me because like the different kinds of landlords all seem to suck in different ways. Like corporate landlords, at least you've got some like level of standard. With like individual landlords, there's just such wide variation in like the jerks versus like good landlords.
That's why tenant protections are so important, right? And they're so absolutely important. And 1/3 of households rent. It can't be left to lock. If you land with someone nice who brings you muffins in the morning and a bottle of wine in the end of the year, or if you like, or it's someone who is awful and is trying to evict you so they can make the next person pay more. It can't be left to lock. And it's kind of interesting because as you know, like in the book, I tried to draw a lot of little comparisons with the labor market, right? And with the labor movement, because I find it useful as a sort of like an educational tool, because people kind of grasp that more. I think like you wouldn't say, there's no minimum wage, we're just gonna good luck, hope your boss is a good one. If they make you work for $3, that sucks. I had a good one the other day who paid me 14. Like, it wouldn't allow for that, right? And so it's really important to have like standard protections and enforceable protections, so that everyone kind of like have something that they can rely on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that might be a good point to talk a little bit about why it's important to think about tenants and landlords as different classes. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think the whole impetus behind the book is to politicize housing. I think the depoliticization of housing, it's not helpful, and it's actually a very deliberate strategy from the real estate industry to be constantly portraying the relationship between landlord and tenants as kind of as something of that kind of happens at the private sphere. You and your landlord will get along and you chat and you sort it out, and the landlord likes to having good tenants, and you're always portraying this as a sort of like amicable and private relationship, right? And then you portray landlords and kind of the mom and pop landlords, and you kind of give them the aura also of a family, of a small business, someone just kind of that just like their tenants, they're also kind of struggling to get by, and that's why they need to rent these places. I think we need to really move away from that and think more about bosses and workers, and to acknowledge that there's a power dynamic, there's an immense imbalance of power between the two sides, and that their interests are opposing. One wants more rent, the other wants to pay less rent, and that we have kind of laws and regulations in place, but they're not neutral. They're laws, regulations. They tend to side with the more powerful, more influenced player, and in our case, it often, not all the case, but often ends with on the side of landlords. So I think it's really important to politicize the relationship so that we can start talking about political solutions and understand policy failures as very successful policies that achieved their desirable outcome of protecting the landed class.
That makes me think about this. There was a study I saw in Toronto years ago. Maybe you remember it, but basically somebody was polling renters and homeowners on like the fact that housing prices in Toronto were going up. And it was like, homeowners love it, renters hate it. It's like, what's more emblematic of like the different interests than that, I guess?
Yes. When you add homeowners to the conversation, it's kind of like a group in the middle there somewhere. Right now, they are benefiting from the rising value of houses. And a lot of people are now counting on this, right? And it's kind of like a separate conversation, but it has a lot to do with the fact that we don't have pension plans. And it's one of the most important parts of this conversation, I think, and the one that we kind of don't talk enough about. Part of this, when we talk about the financialization of housing, a lot of kind of academic shitheads like myself or others, like, we talk about, the sort of the big moves in financial liberalization and the flow of capital, and then the 2008 crisis, and then the real estate investment trusts emerging. That's kind of like what we think about. But it also happened at a much more household level, right? Where for me, there's a distinction between a working family that put down put a payment down on a house, and then they paid throughout, the active working years, and they, of course, they're hoping to finish paying the mortgage by the time they retire, because that will provide them housing security, that will provide them some financial security, right? So that's one kind of yes, it's a commodity. Yes, it's a sort of an asset, kind of they're counting on. It's allowing their family to build some financial security, because they know that if they cannot age in place, they can actually sell the house for a decent amount of money, and that's what's going to help to finance some alternative living that they need. It provides some security. That is one thing. Now, to put that down payment and expect your house to triple, quadruple in value, because you're gonna expect to cash really. You have no other retirement plan. You don't have, any other kind of cushion, because all your money went into your house, but you're expecting it to triple, quadruple in value. So you're gonna sell and you're gonna cash big on it, or yet you're gonna, at some point halfway through your mortgage, you're gonna borrow against it, and then get that money, and you're going to put a down payment in a condo somewhere, and you're just going to rent it, and then let the tenants pay that mortgage for you. So when at the end of your active years, they have this big, house that worth all of this money, and that's one big pot of money. And then you also have the other condo that someone paid for you, and then you also get that. That's a very different kind of. So that's kind of like a financialization happened to, but more at the household level, right? So yeah, I'm not saying that having good pension plans prevent people from doing it. I think some would still go there, but would make people a lot less invested in housing as they're. And when you look at the stats for pension plans, right, the public sector averages still hold, but in the private sector, it has been declining steady.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's really true. I have to imagine that part of the skittishness around governments in terms of addressing the value of housing also has to do with the scenario where you have seniors on fixed incomes with no pensions. What happens to them if the housing market crashes? So yeah, if there was more of a safety net and more people had pensions, then probably it would be easier to unwind that a little bit. But it also goes to your point about why it's so important to politicize this issue, because it really is about the distribution of wealth in society and how much value we allow people to acquire, and how much we allow them to extract literal rents from other people to do so.
In the distribution aspect and the inequality aspect, hopefully there's going to be some major political moves, and there'll be some changes from here to the next 20 or 30 years. But if there isn't, what we're going to see more and more is the intergenerational transfer of wealth. That's going to have a very palpable impact in our imaginary of Canada, of this notion of a middle class society where there's social mobility, and a lot of racialized folks, and a lot of women who have to deal with all sorts of barriers on the labor market, and immigrants who don't always integrate so easily, because a number of factors, they're less likely to believe in that middle class social mobility dream. But there's still a big chunk of our population that holds on to that idea. But when we get into a context where wages don't buy houses,
Yeah, I'm always like a little worried that I think about this just because like Thomas Piketty is constantly in my head. But it really does feel like we're barreling towards the Victorian era again in this sense, like where you really can only get ahead if you have land already, or your family does. All right, let's maybe turn towards something a little bit, hopefully more optimistic, which is tenant organizing as a solution. So can you talk a little bit about the history of tenant organizing in Canada? Because your book makes the great point that it's not at all new.
Yes, that's one of my favorite chapters in the book. I love social history. My earlier academic work looked at the history of social movements in Brazil and how some of them managed to pull it off, all sorts of interesting direct democracy experiments under the military regime. So I love that stuff. And I find it incredibly important to tell the history of social movements, tell the history of everyday struggles, and tell the history of just people coming together and accomplishing all sorts of things and supporting each other and resisting all sorts of horrible things. Our history is told in a way that it's so boring, most importantly, but also so detrimental to collective action, right? Because always this great man doing something, and then he talks to another great man, and then great man to great man decide to do something great, and it's just, oh my God, like this is how, history happened, and it's not, right? So it's really, I find it really important to bring that stuff back and to talk about it. And it's incredibly hard to find information on it. And it's there, right? You talk to folks and someone knows of something, but to find actual documents and written accounts, it's really difficult because our movements are so poorly resourced, right? People are working 10 hours a day and then picking up the kids and preparing dinner and then, putting the kids to bed, and then they're going to do something at 8 o'clock at night, and then it's already 11 o'clock midnight, they have to go to back and start again, and no one, has time, let me write this down. It's really important. Some nerd from 20 years from now, we're going to want to write about it. So there's not a lot of written and evidence and documentation about all of these amazing struggles. So yeah, I there's a chapter that focuses a little bit on this, and it's just a very small sample of pieces and bits of that story. But I found it important to document it, to share what I learned.
Yeah, I'm curious if you can talk a little bit sort of about, just for somebody that hasn't really heard about tenant organizing in any way, what are some of the main ways that tenants can organize, and what are some of the key strategies that they can adopt?
First, important to remind everyone that I'm not an organizer myself. I organize mostly decimal points and semicolons, but I have researched this enough, and I spend now enough time with organizers that I'm learning a little bit more about it, but not too differently from labor organizing, right? It always starts very local. It always starts, at the usually with tenant organizing, it's in buildings. It's the most common place where organizing is going to start. It will be the equivalent of the kind of the factory floor, or the coffee, Starbucks shop, and in the kitchen or something like that. And usually it's also in response to a rent increase that was too high, in response to some maintenance that wasn't dealt with, or in response to the fact that one of the tenants is being evicted or pushed out for whatever reason. And then, a group of folks said, no, that's not fair. We're going to have to go and talk to this landlord. And people kind of know that the power dynamics in that relationship always favor the landlord, right? So one tenant shows up to challenge the landlord on something, it's difficult. But, if 20 of them show up, the outcome might be different. And so that's kind of the very basic principle of it. And as I said, it's pretty straightforward, but sometimes, it grows from there. It goes into other organizations, and that first act of mobilization against one particular incident Sometimes that grows into a more permanent form of organization and of organizing. And then sometimes you create, associations or groups, or more recently, there's more of a tendency to call it tenant unions. And then some of these groups are organizing in similar ways of like labor unions, in that they will have like the local chapter or the local tenant association, and they kind of have like an umbrella organization. So one of the examples that I'm closest to and that I talk about in the book is the York Southwest and Tenant Union in Toronto, and they have various tenants associations, which are usually a building, and usually known by the address of that building. So it's 33 King or 22 John or so on and so forth. And there are, tenants associations with them. And then each one usually have like 2 or 3 tenants that are most active, and they're kind of like the delegates of that particular building. And then there's the tenant union for the entire area. So the delegates, will meet regularly, and then so they can talk strategy for the area as a whole. And whenever one of them has a problem or is in a fight, all of them will try and show up for it and support. It is in some ways similar to unions. In other places, like in Quebec, there's a long tradition of having very local comité de logement, which is like also kind of like a tenant association that deals with a building or a street or a particular very kind of local context. And then they have a couple umbrella sort of associations, or actually the right name is like coalitions, that will pick fights on a larger scale, and then sometimes will not constrain themselves just to be defending and fighting back, but will try to be more proactive on political issues that concern tenants.
One of the strategies that you talked about in the book is going on a rent strike. And I'm just wondering if you can describe what that is and maybe give an example of an instance where that has worked.
Strike. The general idea is that property owners have assets that generate revenues, and you interrupt the flow of revenues so that you catch their attention, you force them to come to the negotiation table and try to come to some sort of agreement. The difference is that with unionized workplaces, workers have the right to a collective bargaining process, and the process has many steps, and strikes are actually very rare because things usually get sorted out, at some point in that process. With tenants, what happens is that they do not have the right to collective bargaining. And so as soon as they say, we would like to negotiate, we would like to talk about this latest rent increase because too much, we can't pay it, landlords just say, nah, we're not going to talk about it. You either pay it, or if you fall into arrears and you don't pay it, I'm going to evict you. So the bargaining process is very short, and boom, you go to a rent strike because there's no other alternative, right? So there is a number of rent strikes throughout Canadian history. Some were successful, some were not. Right now, we have 3 rent strikes in Toronto. These are buildings owned by PSP Investments, which is a crown corporation and the pension fund of federal employees. And the whole area is managed by Starlight, who is the asset manager for PSP Investments. And since May, tenants are on strike because Starlight, on behalf of PSP Investments, applied for above guideline rent increases. Rents are going to go up by an average of 10% over 2 years. Tenants said it's too much, let's negotiate. Starlight said no, we don't want to negotiate. We'll not negotiate with organized tenants. If individuals think that it's too much, they can apply for repayment plans or some sort of support, but we will not negotiate with organized tenants. So that's where the fight is right now. Tenants are starting to receive eviction notices. Some of the hearings are coming up. So if anyone wants to check them out online, the Thorncliffe Park Drive rent strike. They have a GoFundMe page, which might be really helpful because fighting the evictions notes costs money, and it's money that obviously the tenants themselves don't have, or if they pay it, it's going to come at the detriment of other basic necessities for their families. There's another rent strike in New York Southwestern Tenant Union. Same thing with the above guideline rent increases. There's one build that received a bunch of them, and tenants just at some point said it's enough. Our rents are going up by too much, way more than the average. So they were on rent strike since June. Another building joining in July, a building that has no rent controls, because in Ontario, if a building is occupied after November of 2018, there's no rent controls whatsoever. So rents are going up by too much. Tenants are on strike as well. There are possibly other buildings coming on board in Toronto on the rent strike as well.
Yeah, I mean, the rent is too damn high, so I can see why there's so many rent strikes happening right now. One thing that the book talks about is sort of these organizations that take shape after their sort of like smaller level organizing that sometimes go up to like the city level and sometimes the neighborhood level and take on wider political causes in some cases. I'm wondering if there are like any interesting cases of those that you'd want to highlight, or any sort of lessons that you've learned.
Yeah, there are different strategies. Some groups decide to just focus on one geographical area and build a lot of tenant working class power in that one particular area, right? They think that this is the best and most promising strategy to defend working class, to defend tenants and the working class and tenants, and sort of to be ready to essentially support each other no matter what gets thrown at them. It might be an increase in rent. It might be cuts in transit that the community relies on. It may be the large employer in the area suppressing wages. It may be the government trying to displace them. There's a number of things that may happen in any given time. And in this perspective, the best thing we can do is just to build power, to unite the community. And, come what may, we're going to be ready to put a fight and to have each other's back. In other cases, the sort of tenants associations start, grouping and soon kind of form something of at a kind of neighborhood level, and then sometimes they go at the city level, and sometimes even at the provincial level, start engaging in provincial politics. And the rationale there, and I already mentioned the cases with Quebec, right? The rationale in Quebec, for example, in the late 1970s, there's a lot of these tenant associations that had been formed and had dealt one way or another with a bunch of displacements and kind of modernization projects where the city just kind of wanted to move people away from where they were to kind of make something pretty, put something pretty in place and look modern and so on. And so there's a lot of fights in the 1960s and 1970s just kind of against city policies. And what I gathered from the research that I did is that at some point, tenants were just kind of like tired of reacting all the time. And they said, no, we got to get ahead of this. We got to have our own agenda. We got to push for policies and programs and overall get a political power that sets the agenda and changed a little bit the aménagement, the urban planning more broadly. And so that's when they kind of created two broader organizations that would have a little bit of that mandate of not just fighting back at the local level, but also kind of putting up a fight at this other spheres of power, right? And yeah, so I think there's a few different models there too, and then it's sort of on the ground. Folks will decide where they want to go and what's most important for them and what they can do, right? Because again, resources is always a big challenge.
Yeah, I'm curious for a listener who maybe is just achieving class consciousness as a tenant, what would you recommend that they could do to get started?
What I'd say is there's a lot of organizing happening that you may not be aware of, And so the first thing is to go out there and to reach out to either a tenant union or tenant group that is not necessarily in your neighborhood, but it's somewhere nearby, and then talk to them, ask if they know who's doing what in your area, or if there is any sort of like larger social movement that you have a contact with, even if it's not a housing movement or a tenant movement per se. Reach out. They will know, people, and they might help you to connect to. Go on the social media. That's one thing it might be useful for. After all, try to find groups. There's a lot of happening right there, and you may feel kind of a little bit isolated, and you may feel that it's kind of only you and your landlord, but there's people there, and you just kind of have to find them. And once you find, you're going to be able to join.
All right. So to kind of like finish us off here, can I read some of my favorite spicy comments from your book? The first one is, it's not really a crisis if it has lasted more than a century and large sectors of the population wouldn't have it any different, is it? So good. And then right like on the next page, I have never seen an example of elites giving up power and wealth because the experts came up with a bright idea. I was like snapping along to it. I was like, hell yeah. And then I really liked this other part here. You were talking about, well, I'll just read the quote, which is that capital double dips on tenant families by paying low wages from which high rents are subtracted. And I was like, wow, that's a perfect sentence.
And it's happened more and more now with the financialization of housing. We're seeing some of the conglomerates that were active in the grocery business, for example, now also owning houses. So it will, in some cases now, it's actually the same firm that suppresses wages and charges high rents from the same people.
Cool.
Feel it, Weston.
What a fun story. I actually have one final question that I like to ask people, which is, I'm going to lend you like a magic wand and you can fix the housing problems in Canada with my magic wand. What would you do? What would be like overnight? What would you do to fix everything, please?
Move profit out of it.
Yeah, I guess that's pretty much the only thing, right? Like as soon as you stop making a profit on housing, it stops being a problem.
And interestingly, and just sort of to provide a counter argument to the counter argument, often when we say we need to build more non-market housing, when we need to move profit out of housing, there's some disingenuous come back to that and say, wow, governments can't pay for this forever. Like they don't, right? Like the housing, it's not comparable in some ways with education and health, where you have an ongoing operational cost, right? With a lot of non-market housing, and that's for rental, but that's also could be also for ownership. People pay back. People continue to pay rent, or people continue to pay their mortgages on houses that were built for people with low and moderate income. It is just the profit margin that you push out of it. So needs to be some sort of investment from governments, and usually it's the federal government because they have the kind of the financing capacity for that, though provincial governments can do a lot of stuff there too. So that they need to come first and put down some large sums of money so you can build stuff or you can acquire existing stock. But once people move in, they do pay rent, in non-market housing. They do pay rent in co-ops and people, we haven't had a like moderate income ownership kind of program for a long time in this country. But when we do have those, people do pay their mortgage and the loans back to government, right? So the government just has, its role is to do that initial investment and then to wait for people to pay back. And in the case of non-market housing, then the rent becomes sufficient to cover maintenance and utilities and the upkeeping of the building and all of this. It works. We have so many examples that it work, and it's not some sort of socialist utopia. In every city, in almost, every neighborhood in all the major cities, you bump into housing that is not for profit, that is well run, that is good quality, and that doesn't carry an ongoing operational cost to any level of government, right? It's there. It's a very concrete example. So yes, remove profit out of housing. It's possible. We do it every day. It exists. The examples are all there. Just walk around and you see them. But thank you. Thank you for this invitation. It's been great to talk to you. Thank you for the very flattering comments about the book. I sat down mostly because, as I mentioned, my job is to move in commas and semicolons around, and I see the tenant movement are gaining strength, and I'm close enough to see the immense amount of work and the immense amount of energy and sacrifice on the part of those involved, the immense amount of risk that they're taking, those who are on a rent strike. And yes, I was just kind of trying to figure out a way that I could more directly support the movement, to contribute to this amazingly courageous people who are doing so much good work. And yes, and then I wrote a 2-page backgrounder, and I said, I thought I was writing this. Do you guys think it would be useful? And I circulated to a bunch of tenant groups across the country, and I got a really positive feedback. And they said, yes, write it. It's going to be helpful. It's going to be a resource. We need this in articulated in writing, and it's going to help us. And I was like, sure, if you think it's going to help you guys, I can go ahead and do this, because that's what I know how to do it. And I tell that story also by way of encouraging anyone who is in research and advocacy on writing to do work that it's for tenants and not about tenants. The work that is about tenants, it's often not very useful to the movements themselves. It's, I think, a more fruitful approach to reach out, to ask folks, what can I do? How can I help? And do just that. Like it's my Latin Americanist coming through it, because in Brazil, it was very, very clear that anyone in a research and writing position takes direction from the movements and not the other way around.
Support your local bookstore and go buy this book. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for ending on a positive note with us. I feel like the solution to this is not that complicated, but I love this discussion about all of the different ways that people can organize to make their local areas better. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I hope this was useful.